right, in this video, I wanted to spend a few minutes discussing some adaptations that plants evolved, allowing them to move out of the water onto land. And then after plants moved onto land, later on we'll discuss all the plant diversity that we see around us. But we want to begin by understanding the characteristics that plants share that allow them to thrive on the land. So the characteristics that all plants have in common are that they're first photosynthetic. Right? So every single plant shares this common characteristic of being photosynthetic. But the other characteristic that defines plants is that they are terrestrial organisms. So we'll talk about how the fact that plants evolved from photosynthetic aquatic organisms. But what defines a plant is that they evolved and now survive on land. So there are a set of adaptations that made it possible for these plants to survive on land. And that's what we want to discuss in this video. So here we'll provide a list of those adaptations, and then we'll think about each of them individually. So those adaptations that allow plants to survive on land are things like roots. We'll talk about shoots as well. We'll think about the plant's cuticle. We'll look at the leaf structure. And finally, we'll think about reproductive structures that allow reproduction on land. So these set of 5 characteristics represent the set of terrestrial adaptations that allowed plants to evolve and move out of the water onto land. So if we look at a phylogenetic tree of plants, we would have a tree like this. So up here from liverworts to the right, all the way to the flowering plants, these are all the land plants. And the group furthest to the left here, these charophytes, they are the aquatic ancestor of all plants. So it's thought that in the evolutionary past, the common ancestor of today's land plants and those charophytes went through a speciation event, and the land plant branch of the tree evolved these terrestrial adaptations, which allowed these plants to survive on land, right? So we got this branch of plants. So again, we're going to think about the 5 adaptations that are in here that count as these terrestrial adaptations and what each one of them does for the plants. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll think about the first adaptation that plants require to be successful living on a terrestrial environment outside of the water. And the first adaptation we'll consider are the roots. The roots are an easy structure to understand, right? They're the part of the plant here below the soil line. For all of the plants, we're going to assign one important function of the roots. So for all plants, the main function of the roots is to anchor the plant in place. This is important because out on land, there's wind that could blow the plant away, right? We don't want the plant to be blown into a new environment where it may not survive. So the plant anchors itself with roots so that it will remain within an environment that it can thrive in. Now, some plants use the roots for additional functions. Those are the vascular plants. So we'll talk about the adaptation of adding vascular tissue to a plant later on, because that only occurred in some plants. But those plants with vascular tissue also utilize their roots to collect water from the soil. But that isn't the function in every plant, right? So the main function of the roots that all plants share is to anchor the plant in place. Again, those plants that do have vascular tissue, they also absorb water through their roots. All right, so that's the roots, pretty straightforward. Let's now talk about the shoots. Right, so shoots are these structures that emanate up away from the soil in the plant. Okay. In all plants, these do a couple main functions. So they're the support system for the plant. right? They create plant structures. In some organisms, the shoot can be photosynthetic, but it's not always photosynthetic, right? But again, the main purpose of the shoots is to support the plant. All right, so this is different than in the aquatic environment as well. In the aquatic environment, the plant structure could float, and it didn't need a rigid shoot to hold it in place or give it the correct orientation, right? So in the absence of water and buoyancy, plants needed a rigid structure to hold it in place, and that's what the shoots are for. All right. Again, in some plants, the vascular plants, the shoots are going to be important for transporting water and other nutrients throughout the plant. But the common function that all plants share for their shoots is providing structural support. So that's pretty straightforward. Let's move on to another structure called the cuticle. Now, the cuticle isn't shown in this particular diagram of a plant, but the cuticle is found on all plants, and the cuticle performs a very straightforward function. In all plants, this cuticle is a waxy coating that prevents water from being lost from the plant. So this waxy coating keeps water in the plant, doesn't allow it to diffuse out and evaporate away from the plant. Right? So this cuticle is particularly important on land as opposed to an aquatic environment because water is limited on land. Whereas in an aquatic environment, water was abundant. It didn't matter if an organism has this waxy cuticle or not, because there was plenty of water surrounding the plant at all times. Now, out on land, we need this waxy cuticle to make sure water stays inside the plant. All right, so another structure that was evolved in land plants is the leaf. The leaf is another pretty straightforward structure in terms of our understanding right here. We're just going to say that the leaf is a specialized structure that performs photosynthesis. So it's a photosynthetic organ for the plant. And because of the other adaptations that we're making, like the roots and the shoots, and later we'll talk about the reproductive structures, it was important to have a specific structure, the leaf, that can perform photosynthesis, while other parts of the plant were doing other important roles, like anchoring the plant in place or providing structure for the plant. So the leaf is a specialized part of the plant that performs photosynthesis. All right, and then the last adaptation we'll talk about are reproductive structures. So in water, the precursors of plants could reproduce. They could release their reproductive cells into the water. Things could swim and meet up in any number of ways. It's pretty easy to disperse in the water. Things can float to a new location and then establish a new organism in a different spot. But on land, because of the absence of this abundant water, reproduction can be more difficult. So we have some specialized structures. And we'll talk specifically about the details around these structures in another video. But briefly, the structures that all land plants share in common are these specialized structures for reproduction. And we're going to talk a lot about the gametophytes and the sporophytes. So these are specific parts of the plant that aid in reproduction. They perform specific functions so that the plant can reproduce efficiently. Now, some plants, certain kinds of plants, have more specialized reproductive structures. So as we talk about different plants, we will talk about other structures. And in some plants, we'll talk about spores. In certain plants, we'll talk about a pollen grain, what pollen does. In some plants, we'll consider seeds. So not all plants have seeds. We'll figure out which plants do and what that structure does for reproduction. And then flowers are specific reproductive structures that only some plants have. So all plants have some reproductive structures. All plants have a gametophyte and a sporophyte, but only some plants have these other structures. So those are the 5 adaptations that allowed plants to move out of the water onto land. Again, these terrestrial adaptations allowed plants to evolve from these charophytes into the wide diversity of land plants that we find around us today. And so as we go forward, we'll talk specifically about these different types of plants and what other adaptations they have added along the way to make them more and more successful on land. But for right now, we're just going to stop by talking about those terrestrial adaptations, and we'll pick up with some of those other details in another video. So as always, I hope you'll ask me questions on the discussion board if you have any questions, and I will talk to you again soon.